All right, my friends, we finally made it here. The concluding lecture of the Magic Mountain, the introductory and concluding lecture to Mrs. Dalloway, and the concluding lecture to this course. So let's finish the Magic Mountain in summary, like I said we would last time. So we had Walpurgisnacht, Carnival, Mardi Gras, all synonymous. Where Madame Shosha and Hans Castorp finally talked together. I made a major error in speaking. I said that they spoke broken German to each other. No. Hans Castorp is a native German speaker. Madame Shosha is a native Russian speaker. They speak in the language of love, French, with each other, somewhat broken French. In fact, Hans Castorp describes in, I would say, some sort of a Denianizing way French. He says, oh, I can hear it, I can understand it, but I'm not speaking. This is true of all language learners, almost all language learners, that they can hear better than they can speak, that they can comprehend better than they can conjugate, as it were. But he describes the language as if he's not even talking at all, as if he doesn't really even have to think in order to speak in French, which is interesting because syntax-wise, word order and word arrangement-wise, French is extraordinarily similar to English, even more similar to English than Spanish. If you ever translate, say, a French sentence into English, sometimes you can translate word for word for word, whereas there is a reordering of words necessary for German because it is not a subject, verb, object language, but a verb, subject, object, verb language. These are words that do make a difference when you learn these languages and then have to translate. In any case, Madame Shosha and Hans Castorp share a moment. They share a pencil like Sviatoslav Hippa and Hans Castorp, and then Madame Shosha has to go. She leaves Hans Castorp with her negative, her image or her X-ray image of her insides, which is itself a sort of interesting memento. And know that memento is actually a shortened form of a more dire concept, memento mori, which means reminder of death. So it's interesting, people will get a souvenir from traveling. They'll call it a memento, not realize that really what a memento is something that reminds you of the fact that you will die. And you can see how these are useful sorts of images. Like if you go to a Catholic school, crosses on the wall, this is obviously a very sort of barbaric and violent image. What a cross is used for, it's been reappropriated, of course. But it is a reminder to live one's life well, because one will certainly die. And so that Hans Castorp takes this memento mori, but one wonders whether he really looks at it with the appropriate eyes. Does he see it as a reminder of the fact that he will die? Does he see it as a reminder of the fact that he must leave the Burgh at some point, either alive or dead? Or does he see it as some, this is more of a negative way of putting this, as more of a keepsake, something that is just kept for the sake of itself. In any case, he decides to wait at the Burgh for Madame Shosha to come back. He finds out that she spends her time usually between 2 or 3 sanatoriums. She, curiously, like Hans Castorp, also locates her freedom in the fact that she is ill, perhaps offering a perspective contrary to Settembrini's. She says that it is in fact because she's ill that she can be free from the confines of her relationship with her husband. You know, this is very modernist, very Molly Bloom-esque, very anti-Mrs. Dalloway, in that it is the responsibilities of marriage and of being with her husband that she wishes to escape, to be free from the bonds of, and that her illness, which is apparently not so bad that it is nearly fatal at this point in her life, affords her the freedom to travel about and apparently to take on romantic liaisons wherever she wishes to be. She has a friend down in town who she talks existential philosophy with while smoking cigarettes. It's extraordinarily existentialist thing to do, is to smoke cigarettes and talk about being. It's a very much stereotype, but a funny one, I would say, and also not a very pernicious one, an innocuous one. She also seems to have had some sort of strange relationship with Dr. Behrens, Director Behrens, who not only knows her, he says subcutaneously, beneath the skin. That is a suggestive way to say that you know somebody, by the way. Yes, perhaps as a physician, a doctor, a surgeon, he looks at her insides. There's a very much non-medical way to read him saying that he knows her subcutaneously from the inside. You understand exactly what that could mean, I think. And so there's also a question mark, is Hans Castorp in competition with Director Behrens, a man who's actually achieved something, has children, is a physician, a surgeon, and a remarkable, and a director of an institute. Hans Castorp's, an intern who doesn't even make money. How is he supposed to compete with such a man as Director Behrens? But that question is left to the side. Director Behrens and Hans Castorp share their cigarettes with each other. Again, very interesting sort of thing to share. You notice the similar sort of, not nature, but shapes of a cigarette and a pencil. Though, of course, the effect and the use of the cigarette is very different from the pencil. One creates with a pencil. You notice that many rituals that we have as humans involve poisoning ourselves to bring ourselves to a lower self stage of consciousness in order to connect with each other. Drinking, for example, is actually poisoning ourselves. People smoke cigarettes together. You've probably heard of like peyote rituals among the Native Americans, and even ayahuasca ones along those who live along the Amazon. What is the notion underlying taking one of these poisonous narcotic substances with another person? The idea is that you lower your defenses out of trust with such a person in order to build trust and a relationship with an individual. And so when Hans Castorp is palling around with Director Behrens, there's sort of an equal sign put between them. Maybe, I think, very similar to you, sitting down and having a drink, or if this were a different time, 50 years ago, smoking a cigarette with your professor. There's a certain equality with it. Though in normal social circumstances, you would not necessarily recognize that equality. Usually your professor would be teaching, you'd be the student, but when having a cigarette, having a beer, perhaps sharing a latte or an energy drink like we talked earlier, there is equivalency stated. But also this equivalency perhaps suggests equivalency in Madame Xoxo's mind, which makes these two individuals who are trying to become perhaps pals, also rivals to some extent. That said, Professor Behrens is not the biggest rival that Hans Castorp faces during his time for Madame Xoxo's heart or arm, as it were. Who knows who gets her heart, whether anybody does. But when she returns in the company of a man, her husband? No. One Mynheer Peeperkorn, or Peppercorn, excuse me. I think it is, in fact, Peeperkorn, who is himself a very dynamic personality, similar to certain world leaders who practice, who use the literary term anapolicon, people who start a sentence and then cut themselves off and start another sentence and never get to the point that they were talking about. Mynheer Peeperkorn cannot share a coherent thought. He doesn't think coherent. He is a creature of sensuality and experience. What do I mean? He is described as being very large, having wispy hair, looking very Dutch, as it were, blonde, blue eyes, pale, and he has an intensity to him. And there's also a violence. People want to pacify him because he's a little bit intimidating, sort of like Director Behrens. He lives vividly, even though he is in a sanatorium. That is because he had been an industrial magnate, somebody who made millions of dollars, equivalently speaking, somebody who has done what he wanted during his life and caught some sort of malarial flu from his wide travels. Again, think about being Hans Castorp. You're a young man, intern, not much to your name in terms of accomplishment, in terms of skills at this point, in terms of experiences of travel, the sorts of things that you think make one interesting to the people around one. And now he has this person who has built, something, not, I wouldn't say a corporate empire. We don't know whether it's in fact a corporate empire, but something that has made him rich and magnificent and has attracted the interest of Madame Xoxo, who now travels with this man and seems to sleep in the same room as him. And Hans Castorp, who has been waiting faithfully for this married woman to return to this place of convalescence, now has to navigate the difficulty of dealing with yet another rival lover. Let's see. Oh, yes. And something I said about him living vivaciously. This is really brought out in the dining hall when he has breakfast, he orders extra strong coffee. He also orders alcohol with his breakfast. Every single meal, he's downing tons of coffee, as well as bottles, not a bottle, not a drink of wine, champagne, various liqueurs. He's trying to have a really, really, really good time. And poof, an idea should start to occur to you. You're like, sort of older man who's sort of conquered the world, as it were, in a businessy sort of way, rather than military or political sort of way, is now confined to a sanatorium, sort of place where one either gets healthy and survives, which seems to be the minority case, or dies. What must he know about himself to live so riotously in a hospital? Do you drink copious amounts of stimulants like caffeine and suppressants or depressants like alcohol when you're trying to get well? Think about your own lives. When you are trying to get well, perhaps after alcohol or something like too much caffeine the day before, usually you do things like hydrate, get electrolytes in yourself, stay away from alcohol and caffeine. You do know that when you're addicted to both, you do need a little in order to get rid of the pain. That's why people who are hungover sometimes drink alcohol. But all that does is put off the pain that is coming for a little bit of time, because the feeling of a hangover is the feeling of being withdrawn from a substance one has overconsumed, as it were. In any case, what is he doing? He seems to have one foot in the grave. It takes 2 or 3 days at a time to have his fever. His fever overcomes him. He must stay in his room. So when we see him, he lives riotously, vivaciously, sensually, but it puts him down for days. Well, Hans Castorp attempts to start a relationship with Mynheer Peeperkorn in order to annoy, but also be able to spend time with Metempsychosis. It does annoy her. She doesn't understand why this rival lover to her current lover, who was her lover, would not be in conflict with her current lover. But they do become friends, and there is even a moment where Mynheer Peeperkorn says, well, oh, I just figured it out. Hans Castorp thinks he's Ditz, and thinks he can speak around him and do things without Mynheer understanding them, perhaps the same way that Sutton Breedy thinks of Hans Castorp. But Mynheer realizes at one point, oh, you had a relationship with Claudia Shosha, with Madame Shosha, Madame Shosha, I've caused you some pain because of that. And he says, well, if I were a younger man and in health, I would offer you satisfaction because of that. This is an old custom, a custom that was still around in the early 20th century, really mostly at the end of the 19th century. It's often outlawed, but still exists. The idea of giving satisfaction is the idea of a duel. Throw down some item of effect, and then to have a second, and then to establish some sort of weapon, usually a pistol, and some number of steps between individuals for duels that were meant to be fatal, which they often were not. One could still get into legal trouble because of them, because they were often illegal in countries, though honor doesn't always care what's legal or not. You can think of high school and the various fights that were set up between people that were not allowed, and yet honor dictated them. And duels that are meant to be fatal, one only takes so many steps away from individuals, 5, 6. Ones that are meant to be a little bit less, maybe 8 or 9, and often 3 shots are allowed. The shots either go to, whether somebody draws blood, which is sort of the civil idea, and one is not technically supposed to aim to kill, though shooting, especially with guns in the early 20th century, tough to avoid that sort of thing. Tougher to hit one's target, but still, because of that, tough to make sure one is on target. There is a duel that does happen in this text, but between 2 characters one would not expect, the 2 intellectual characters. In any case, I'll mention that right after I say that Mynheer Peeperkorn says that he would have offered satisfaction to Castorp. One wonders how well Hans would do against a young, robust Mynheer, but they share this poignant moment. Just a little bit later on from that, Hans Castorp finds out that Mynheer is dead and is led into his room, and it seems that Mynheer had a vial of poison with an interesting interlocking top, where one like takes it out and stabs oneself like a viper's fangs, and committed suicide, suggesting that the days that Mynheer had living with Claudia, engaging in conversation with Hans to the extent that he could, drinking strong coffee and alcohol over and over, was supposed to be something like a celebration of his life. So in the same way that Seddenbrady represents something like a humanist, desire to live rationally and to improve human life and to reduce human suffering, so does a character we haven't talked about, we're going to have to talk about just very briefly, Leo Naphta, who's ethnically Jewish, like many Irish individuals think in Ulysses that Leopold Bloom is incorrectly, though Molly Bloom actually is, and they don't think that of her. Though he is ethnically Jewish, he is a member, though not full member, of the Jesuit order, SJ, Society of Jesus Catholic. The Jesuits, as you may know, like are most, and if you're from New Orleans, you definitely know this because people will tell you which high school they went to and they'll say Jesuit after the time. The Jesuits are the order of Catholics that are most responsible for teaching and education, whereas the Dominicans were responsible for combating heresy, and Franciscans for attempting to bring about physical and spiritual, physical poverty in order to bring about spiritual wealth in individuals. You may say, that St. Francis took the vow of poverty, took off all of his clothes from his rich father, gave them back to him, which I always say is very ironic because the city I was born in is called San Francisco, St. Francis, and it's one of the richest cities in the world. In fact, it has a Golden Gate Bridge, which is itself a symbol that I've seen throughout the world as a symbol of American wealth. The Golden Gate Bridge, the Obama Institute in Mainz, Germany. They have a poster on their wall of the Golden Gate Bridge, as if it is a symbol for something like we were talking about earlier, some heavenly sort of place towards which one constantly aspires. And that's my home. And it was based on, it's based on a saint who took a vow of poverty, which, well, irony is one of the great stings of life that like the mosquito, tends to get all of us. In any case, this Leo Naphta and Seddenbrady, at some point, Hans Castorp realizes he is not up to the task of engaging in discourse with Seddenbrady. Seddenbrady's too much. He's like a college professor who's devoted his entire life to thinking and writing. And Hans Castorp is very much like, a late stage undergrad. He's graduated, but again, he has a technical education. He's not a philosophical. He has a philosophical spirit to some extent, but he doesn't have a philosophical education, as it were. He's not trying to be a priest. He's not trying to be a professor. He's not trying to be a lawyer. He wants to be an engineer. He cares about math, science. So this Leo Naphta, who is himself a Jesuit, religious, takes a position against Seddenbrady, and they argue about the nature of the world and the nature of progress. And they hold opposing positions, but the positions are constantly swapping, suggesting that really it's not any particular position or ideal which they oppose, but that they oppose each other. And that there is something, and if you wish to read this allegorically, perhaps Seddenbrady as a representation of secularism, modern rationalism, of the scientific way of thinking, is in antipathy against the religious perspective. Perhaps there is something in the religious perspective, the Judeo-Christian one at least, that suggests that suffering is necessary. You read the notion of the fall and women having childbirth and enmity with snakes and men having to work. And those quotes made it a long way into the Middle Ages for affecting people's ideas on what the nature of work was and whether we need to work. But you can see how Seddenbrady has more of a socialist attitude. He thinks, well, if we can remove suffering from the equation, human life will be better. And so we should do anything necessary in order to limit suffering. This is one of the beautiful ideas underlying socialism and communism, by the way. The problem with those notions is not their utopian ideas. It's often the execution of them by imperfect humans. In any case, Leo Naphta, however, suggests that no, humans are cruel and terrible creatures that should suffer, and that the dignity of human life is actually improved by the fact that humans suffer. He and Seddenbrady do not agree on this, and they fight so hard on this intellectually that Leo Naphta eventually insists on a duel with Seddenbrady. Imagine two of your college professors arguing on a stage in front of you and then one throwing down a glove and saying, let's shoot it out. I mean, that might make what they had to say to each other on the stage even more interesting. They do have this duel. Seven Brady refuses to shoot. He refuses to shoot at Leo Naphta, which to some extent obviates the duel. Makes it so that even if Leo Naphta were to shoot at Seven Brady, he would be shooting at an unarmed opponent. He would be doing something more like murder than self-defense. That's the problem. That's one of the problems with a duel, right? Somebody chooses to shoot into the air prior to your shot. Are you allowed to shoot at them? Because what have they done by shooting straight into the air? They have acknowledged they are not going to shoot at you. So are you still defending yourself if you shoot that person? This puts people in an awkward position, especially if you hate the person that you're going to fight against. You really do want to take the shot. But especially also if you're a Catholic who wants to die, because Leo Naphta is also sick, just like Seven Brady. Seven Brady eventually moves away from the Berghof and occupies a shabby little apartment, similar to his shabby clothes, the same pair of pants that he's always wearing, his checkered green pants. Leo Naphta has a very nicely adorned place as a comment on the wealth of the Jesuits in contrast to Franciscans. If you want to see the most beautiful places you have ever seen, you should go to Jesuit university campuses, not Loyola New Orleans, or former monasteries like Pacifica has. Marquette, for example, has a very beautiful campus. Georgetown, which is Catholic, also, Georgetown is Jesuit. They're also very beautiful as well. Libraries at Jesuit, as you would imagine, libraries at Jesuit schools tend to be immaculate, very much amazing. In any case, Leo Naphta wants to be shot, to be killed, to be relieved of his illness and of his mortal coil. However, Seven Brady shoots into the air. Leo Naphta is put into a difficult situation. He wishes to die. He doesn't want to commit suicide, but ultimately, one desire prevails over the other. He commits suicide in front of Hans Castorp and Seven Brady. This is a powerful moment where a religious figure chooses death from illness over commitment to his own faith. It's powerful. In any case, and then also, we should spend just a moment before moving on to Mrs. Dalloway talking about the fate of Joachim. We talked earlier about the role Hans Castorp may have had in Joachim's death, and that Hans Castorp would be something like a tourist among these tubercular individuals, doesn't seem to be as seriously afflicted as they are, though there are many who are seriously afflicted. This starts to work on Joachim's consciousness, and he does not wish to be like Hans. He wishes to get back to his life, get back to his regiment, get back to barking out orders that Seven Brady says. And so, eventually Joachim puts his foot down during a checkup with Director Behrens, though Director Behrens suggests that, and this comes from Joachim, his fever chart is low one week, and then it's higher the next week. And he says, what is the rationale behind this? Am I ever going to get out of this place? Is he just trying to keep me here in some infernal limbo? He no longer trusts the process. And so he thinks, I might as well just go down to the flatlands. He seems to identify to some extent with the health that Hans Castorp has, which Joachim does not. Joachim returns to the flatlands. At first, he's having a brilliant career, has a promotion, things sound really good. But then he starts showing evidence of illness, has to take a little time away from his regiment, and then, very, very sadly, is sent back to the Berghof with his mother. Then the original situation is inverted, and then Hans Castorp meets Joachim. Joachim is then sort of flustered by the air and is sort of stimulated, overstimulated when he's speaking to Hans Castorp. And there's a moment of sort of genuine affection between them where they're happy to see each other again. And yet the circumstances under which they are brought back together are sad and soon to be tragic ones. Joachim will not get better at the Berghof. He has sickness unto death. He dies. The first dream of Hans Castorp's stay at the Berghof, where he saw Joachim sliding down the mountain on one of those terrible bobsleds, came true. And then years of sort of dissolution follow for Hans Castorp, where he studies opera, studies music. People get sort of negative in the Berghof, interestingly enough, right prior to the war. Perhaps there was tension between the various Russians, Italians, and Germans, and English there. And they even get into the occult. Things like tarot or tarot and Ouija boards, things that you can see in New Orleans that have guilds still to this day. And there's apparently a young medium there who in games of, so somebody will hold cards and what's the card? She won't be able to see it and she can guess it. And she finally says, well, that's because I have this friend who's a ghost who looks over your shoulder and then tells me. And people think, oh, she's a medium. We should have a seance and summon somebody from the dead. Hans Castorp is invited to do this. Nobody knows who to summon. That's the question. You go to a seance. Who are you going to summon? Some famous figure, somebody that you personally know? Well, Hans Castorp's given the choice. Who does he choose? Joachim Simpson. And he summoned Joachim. He appears. He speaks to Hans Castorp and says, I've been watching you. This freaks out Hans Castorp, who's very much a realist, like we're realists. If you saw a ghost, would you be freaked out? It might upset your worldview to see such a thing, particularly if you're rationalist. Hans Castorp runs up to Dr. Krakowski, who's there, shakes him a little bit, and then runs out. And that's the end of that. The text concludes ambiguously. Hans finds himself on a battlefield in Belgium, one of the great theaters of World War I. And there are bombs being dropped around him, and the narrator leaves him there and says, we don't know what happens to Hans Castorp, but we do know that this is the end of his story, and we wish him the best. It's very similar to White Lotus putting the Radcliffe family in season 3 impoverished, but not showing their reaction to learning that they'd lost all of their money. You probably know what happened to them, but it is left to your imagination. And so in a text that spills so many words and describes so many things, what happens to our protagonist, our ordinary, mediocre Hans Castorp is, well, left up to you. And so you may have your own thoughts on that. That's it. We have to move on from that a little bit. Mrs. Dalloway. Mrs. Dalloway in a nutshell. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. So much in this very first line written by Virginia Woolf in 1925, partially in response to James Joyce's 1922 work featuring Ulysses, featuring the comings and goings, perhaps too literally, more literally than I would like, of Leopold Bloom, Steve and Daedalus, and Molly Bloom in the occupied city of Dublin. Remember that Dublin then, according to Stephen's Lights, is occupied, Ireland is occupied by their political imperialist masters, the English. At that time, the English owned Ireland, and thus Ireland became part of Britannia. And also, Stephen suggested that religiously speaking, the Irish were occupied by the Romans, the Roman Catholics, the Italians, as it were. Virginia Woolf's Mrs. Dalloway, Clarissa Dalloway, finds herself far more in the sort of place that Hans Castorp comes from. In the same way that I said that Germany is the most powerful nation in Europe, economically speaking, today, and also prior to World War I. So was it in not in conflict, in competition with England. And even today, England and Germany are in competition to be the 4th or 5th most powerful nation in the world. The United States, China, Russia, and then competition between England and Germany. So this work, like Thomas Mann's work, comes from a powerful nation that is itself colonizing and imperializing rather than that which was colonized. And so there is evidence of this throughout the text, including the fact that one of the major characters, one Peter Walsh, former lover and potential husband, suitor of Clarissa Dalloway, is back from India. Well, what was he doing in India? He has business interests in India, which at that time was owned, protected, was a province of Britain, showing the imperial might of these British in the everyday lives of these individuals. In any case, you notice also the commentary on society. Mrs. Dalloway said she would buy the flowers herself. This is a major contrast to Molly Bloom, referred to as Mrs. Marion Bloom. Clarissa is not called Mrs. Clarissa Dalloway. She would be called Mrs. Richard Dalloway, but she is referred to by the text title itself and the very first words as Mrs. So you see that this is a person who occupies a social role. You see also that what does this text start with? The fact that she speaks. Molly Bloom must wait until the very last chapter of Ulysses to speak. And yet, what do we have in the very first line of Mrs. Dalloway? We have a female author writing a female character who is speaking for whom? Speaking for herself, finally. Though the notion of her speaking for herself is upset by the fact that obviously she is identified as being in a social relationship, a family relationship with a man. And so though she speaks for herself, she is not in a traditional sense of the word independent from her circumstances by any means. And so this is, I think, something powerful to keep in mind. Sometimes we often tell you half of the equation. You should see the full one. Though she gets to speak for herself, she is still enmeshed in the situation she finds herself in. Just being able to speak for oneself does not alter one's circumstances irrevocably. It gives one the capacity to alter one's circumstances. Remember these processes. It's not A or B, it's the path between them that's real. In any case, Clarissa Dalloway was having a party that evening, and even the fact that she's having a party is because of her notions of her husband, who is something of a high-ranking official, Richard Dalloway. She has these parties where high-ranking functionaries and dignitaries from court and society in Bloomsbury, London. Bloomsbury, very famous for being a literary and very wealthy area of London. She has these parties for her husband, for her idea of the husband. And so she has these parties not just for herself or because she is in some way superficial, shallow, but because she wishes to honor the notion of what her relationship means and who her husband is. You can see there too that the very rationale underlying the party that is mentioned in the very first line of this text suggests that there is something like an imaginary or an illusion-like connection between even married couples, that you have ideas about each other that are not necessarily accurate. It's not necessary that she's inaccurate in her idea of Richard Dalloway, but it is the case that perfect knowledge does not seem to exist between any human, even married humans, who one would imagine, of all humans, have a very good idea of each other. That said, Clarissa's name is a very clear reference to the English literary past. There was a book named Clarissa, and this one was, of course, published in 1925. This has been Metempsychosis. Clarissa is a famous English novel by Samuel Richardson from 1748. Ironically, it is often considered a masterpiece and is one of the longest novels in the English language, whereas Miss Dalloway is often 220 pages, not one of the shorter, but definitely a shorter work of literature. And Virginia Woolf did write Mrs. Dalloway as something of a response to Ulysses, as you can tell. One day, London instead of Dublin, all of the realist bookmarks. The fact that she gives characters a very rich backstory and also forestory. Not only do you learn about what's happened in the history of these largely characters in their 50s, but you also have some expectation that something's going to happen. On this day, the former lover of Clarissa Dalloway returns from India and claims that he has met a married woman in India and is going to marry her. And yet, during the course of this day, Let me make sure that I get this here. Yes. Yes. During the course of this day, Peter Walsh and Clarissa Dalloway think about their former relationship. He's 53, she's 52. Like Don Quixote, we have an older protagonist and a set of characters. During this day, Peter Walsh thinks about going to Clarissa's party and seeing what happens. What could possibly happen? She has a daughter. She has a husband. She has a home. She has a whole life away from this man who's been away in India for 6 years, himself with socialist leanings, and is considered a failure by British society. Perhaps because of his odd, wacky ideas compared to their more traditionalist ideas. But during the course of the day, he thinks about the notion of being with Clarissa. What if she had chosen him? But what if these what ifs don't just exist in the past, but in the present? And Clarissa is also forced to face her past with Peter Walsh in order to forge a future. We are left at the end of the day wondering what is going to happen between these individuals. What is going to happen between Mrs. Keelman and Elizabeth Dalloway, the daughter of Clarissa, this strange religious convert who converted 2 years ago and talks only about what she's missing. She says she's something like a wheel without a tire, that all life's afflictions harm her. What is going to happen between Peter Walsh and Clarissa Dalloway? Clarissa also sees her former good friend and occasional lesbian lover, Sally Seaton, who at her party shows up with 5 boys. You can see that part of this text is talking about the time one loses between youth and sort of late middle age. That it's like one makes all these serious decisions in their early 20s. Who's one going to marry? What sort of job is one going to have? And then life kind of catches one up. And these individuals return to something like a second 20s in their 50s, now confronted with the weight of their decisions and the weight of the history between themselves, but also the weight of the consequences of their choices. Is this the life that I would have wanted to live? You imagine that this is the sort of thinking that Alonso Quijada must have been going through before he donned the name of Don Quixote. Is this all that life is for? And do I still have time to make a change? It's a tough question for a human in their 50s. Even these days where you can live in your 90s or your 100s, a lot of time gone. And once one is to one's 50s, generally we're not still in the same sort of physical shape as we were in our 20s as well. And so it can be harder to make transitions and major changes to one's life as one gets older, even if one is not yet old. In any case, the lives of Virginia Woolf and James Joyce are similarly connected. Their very birth and death dates suggest a parallelism. Joyce was born February 2nd, 1882, and died January 13th, 1941. Woolf was born January 25th, 1882, and died March 28th, 1941. The span of their lives was mere months apart. Henke observes that the news of Joyce's premature death, Woolf must have felt the same kind of shock experienced by Clarissa Dalloway at Bradshaw's announcement of Septimus Smith's suicide. This is something else unique about Mrs. Dalloway. Not only does our female author Virginia Woolf give us a representation of a female consciousness going through the course of the day, in the same way that James Joyce gives us 2 male consciousnesses and then a bit of female consciousness, though from his male perspective, so does, I think, radically, Virginia Woolf attempt to represent a man with shell shock, a man who has been to war, fought on the battlefield. You should understand how far removed from this experience Virginia Woolf was in Bloomsbury, London. This is high society. She'd never been anywhere close to a battlefield. And so for her to try and represent not only a man who had been through war, but a man who was then driven mad by war, who was traumatized so badly that he commits suicide because he thinks he has committed a crime against human nature. And he can hear voices talking to him from the trees and sees his dead friend Evans. This is a very unique representation of what war does to people can do to people and to a male figure going through it. I think similar, something's I think analogically equivalent would be if James Joyce had tried to represent Mynheer Peeperkorn in the process of giving birth. This is about as different from James Joyce's experience of living as anything could possibly be. No man ever knows the pain or the emotions of childbirth, particularly in the early 20th century when there weren't questions of gender dynamics in the same way that there are these days. We might open that question differently now, but it wasn't open at that particular time. In any case, Virginia Woolf then takes on the task of representing a mad person who had been through war, who was a male. And so you see here that she is taking on a huge task by doing this. And not only is he mad and has been through war, but he is somebody that commits suicide. You see, this is a huge modernist notion. This is the sort of thing that is often repressed by religious authorities, and something you may have even noticed in your own lives if you unfortunately have known a young friend to die, is that when people die by suicide, it is often not said that they died by suicide in the newspapers. It says they died from some unfortunate thing. And so you're not usually told by family or media when this happens because of consideration for the dignity of a family, but also you can see underlying that sort of religious ideas that well, it was once the case, and I believe still is the case, that if one is Catholic and commits suicide, one is not allowed to be buried on sacred ground, Catholic ground. And so it's a very sensitive subject. And to have it represented by this person from high society who is in large part separated from many of the vices and terrible things in life, poverty, tons of illness, war, is unique and impressive. And in any case, I only have a couple minutes, so I need to make some connections. This text has a clear connection to Ulysses and occupying one day, one city, and a major and also jumping around between the minds of characters. We get Lucrezia Warren Smith's perspective. She's the one married to Septimus Warren Smith, who takes his own life. We get the perspective of Elizabeth Dalloway, the daughter Clarissa Dalloway. We get Peter Walsh's perspective and him messing around with his pocket knife, which really adds to the realism of his character, that he has a tick like that. And we even get Mrs. Kilman's perspective. And apparently people don't like her much because she's a little bit too much of a fan of the Germans at this time. And the Germans were the great enemies of the English in two major wars, and also through a lot of history from the Middle Ages on, because they wanted similar things. That creates conflict. Barons and Hans Castorp, right? In any case, this is a representation of a characteristic English life. Royalty passes by them. They're like, is that the prime minister? Or is that the queen? Or is that the prince who passed by? Some dignitary in a car. Cars are present now in this world, not just horse and buggy. We see that the world is being colonized by the English and the presence of India in the discourse. And of course, Septimus Warren Smith has terrible trauma from shell shock in World War I. We get our female perspective for our primary main character, but also minor perspectives. Mrs. Kilman, Elizabeth Dalloway, as well as Lucrezia Warren Smith. Notice that the name is Lucrezia Warren Smith, Mrs. Warren Smith, as she would be referred to at that time. The work is also written in stream of consciousness from multiple perspectives. And as I said, and have said now multiple times, witnesses or displays, articulates a man losing his mind. I'd say more about these characters, but I need to wrap up the course really quick. Modernism. How can a work be perpetually modern? How do the principles of revolt transcend time and space? These are questions I expect you to answer in your own minds. How do both Don Quixote from the 17th century, early in the 17th century, and Mrs. Dalloway from early in the 20th century feature a revolt against some classical analog, for example? How does modernism relate to postmodernism? I'll say one thing about this before I move on, and then we all move. Postmodernism in Western philosophy, a late 20th century movement characterized by broad skepticism, subjectivism, or relativism, is a general suspicion of reason and an acute sensitivity of the role of ideology in asserting and maintaining political and economic power. And then I get a more philosophical definition. Postmodernism is indefinable, is a truism. However, it can be described as a set of critical, strategic, and rhetorical practices employing concepts such as difference, repetition, and traits, the simulacrum, and hyper-reality to destabilize other concepts such as presence, identity, historical progress, epistemic certainty, and univocity of meaning. Modernism still takes standards, values, and classical texts seriously. It just opens up the question of what is truly valuable. It does not question whether anything has value. One questions whether postmodernism refines one's perspective on values or simply problematizes the form of the inquiry into the question, thus stalling the pursuit. Does postmodernism put you at A with no path to B, whereas modernism tries to suggest that A and B are not as important as that which lies between them? Is modernism a more valuable philosophy to you than postmodernism? It's a question that I'll leave you with as you leave this course. All right.